First, I couldn't get JimFirestone.com to come up on my iPad.
Okay, I think it's all right now. Okay, can everybody hear me now?
Thank them for waiting.
Okay, Dale, thank you for waiting and for sticking with it. Hi, Jason Bessie. How are you? Very nice to see you. How's my sound? Is it all right? Yepers, sounds fine. Great. That's excellent. I'm glad to see it finally happen. I don't know what was going on tonight, but it seemed like my stream was going out okay, but it didn't seem like it was getting to Facebook for some reason, which accounts for why this is the third time, and the third time is the charm. Okay, I'm glad that that's true. But okay, the subject for tonight, okay, my subject for tonight is Bernie's Justice and Safety for All plan. I think that's a very, very significant plan that he released. It looks like a lot of work was put into the plan, and looks like something that is very badly needed. It's been going on for many years now. Hi, Linda Four. It's nice to see you. Uh, yeah, it has been a little bit of a while. So, for some time now, okay, it's been the case that our criminal justice system seems to seems to be a criminal injustice system. I think that's apparent, okay, to all of us. It really discriminates against the poor, both in the pre-incarceration phase and then in the incarceration phase, okay, as well. The term of incarceration, okay, is different, but also the rate of convictions, okay, is really vastly different. Uh, Dale says he's been having trouble with other streams tonight, so he thinks it's a Facebook glitch. I suppose it could be. So anyway, uh, it's kind of looked like our criminal justice system was falling apart, or has been falling apart, and that it currently is operating in a way which is in which there's a terrible amount, okay, of inequality and a terrible amount of injustice at the same time. And it doesn't look like there's simply one thing that's wrong. It looks like a whole range of things, okay, that are wrong. And so I think Bernie Sanders is really determined to do something about that. He's indicated that in various statements, but now he's released a program that's a comprehensive program, and he also gave a major speech on Sunday about it, okay, in Iowa, and he'll be talking about it now as one of the main things in what he's offering to the American people. So I thought it was important for us to go over it, even though there's going to be a lot of detail, okay, in going over it, and even though, of course, it is not appropriate for most of the live streams that you see and for most of the videos that you see, but it is appropriate for the in depth program, which is what this program is, and it is appropriate for the Center for the Public Purpose. And of course, I'm live streaming tonight on behalf of the Center for the Public Purpose. So let's begin now to go over Bernie's program. Okay. Let me shift screens here. Get to my other view. which, sorry, I can fix that easily enough. There we go. That should have fixed it. Let's see. Yes, that is Bernie's Justice and Safety for All program. And I gave you the link to that in the description. Okay. So let's begin to go over it, and you'll see it up there as I scroll down. Okay, I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to hit the high points, but there are so many high points. Anyway, Bernie says, he talks about the problem with the number of people in America who are locked up. He points out that we lock up more than 2 million people in America, which is more of our own people than any country on earth. And he says that doesn't include another 5 million people who are under the supervision of the correctional system. And then he points out hundreds of thousands of incarcerated people in America have not been convicted of a crime, and they're in jail solely because they can't afford their bail. And then he makes a very powerful statement, I think, a true statement. We are criminalizing poverty. We are. And he goes into some of the historical reasons, the institutional racism in this country, mass incarceration disproportionately falls on the shoulders of black and brown people in America. And he talks about the disproportionate number of arrests and convictions, in spite of the fact that the frequency of use, okay, of a drug like, well, I won't even call it a drug, but a, uh, a okay, a plant-based supplement that has been criminalized over the years, specifically marijuana, even though people in different groups are using that at roughly the same rate. Unfortunately, black Americans are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for having marijuana than white Americans. Talks about the disparities pervading every aspect of the criminal justice system. And his page says, when Bernie is president, we'll finally make the deep and structural investments to rebuild the communities that mass incarceration continues to decimate. And then he says, we must move away from an overly punitive approach to public safety and start focusing on how to safeguard our communities, prevent the conditions that lead to arrests, and rehabilitate people who've made mistakes. And then he divides up his program into topics, okay, different topics. The first one is to end profiteering in our criminal justice system. And then he talks about all of the ways in which profiteering, okay, is going on. He gives examples of different states, such as, for example, in Mississippi, the rate of violent assault in private prisons is 2 to 3 times that of we find in the publicly run facilities. And he talks about atrocities like juveniles as young as 13 years old who were common targets of sexual assault at one facility. He points out that corporations and police departments rake in billions in fines and fees from disadvantaged communities, and says the prison phone industry, for example, is a monopoly business worth more than $1 billion a year, with companies charging sky-high fees for telephone calls that many families can't afford to pay to keep in touch with their loved ones. Today, 1 in 28 children has an incarcerated parent. 1/5 of these children are under 4 years old. Children with incarcerated parents tend to do worse in school, experience anxiety and depression, and develop behavioral issues. Points out that corporations and cities alike are raking hundreds of $1 millions in fines off the backs of the most vulnerable communities. And now I'm throwing a comment of my own. This is particularly galling when you know that the shortage, of revenues for cities is due to the fact that we don't have an active program in revenue sharing from the federal government going to cities to make up for losses in the tax base of most of our cities due to changes in our economic system over a period of time. But cities and states are very desperate for money, especially since the great crash of 2008. They have never really recovered from this. They haven't been able to afford to spend anything on infrastructure. They're short of funds for education. They desperately need to have a revenue sharing program from the federal government makes up for their losses. Now we know the federal government can afford such a program because the federal government can create the money it needs to end shortages in public areas, to ease the plight of cities and states that are currency users as opposed to currency issuers. Knowing that, the idea that cities have to rake in hundreds of millions, feel they have to rake in hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and fees off the backs of our most vulnerable communities, that is particularly galling, and we see that it's a consequence of the neoliberal system that we have fully developed in this country since the middle 1970s. Bernie says, but it should not be this way, going back to Bernie's page. Everyday people who already are struggling to get by should not be made to subsidize the criminal justice system. Absolutely. Right now, a person charged with an offense who cannot afford a lawyer is often charged a public defender fee and levied court costs, even if that person is not convicted of any crime. More than 40 states use driver's license suspension as a means of pressuring people to pay various court fees, which means people cannot drive to work to earn a living, so they could pay those court fees, right? The inability to pay fines or fees can also lead to people spending far more time incarcerated, effectively creating modern day debtors' prisons. It's about time that somebody in power or somebody running for office brought this issue up, that we have recreated in an indirect way the old abuse of debtors' prisons for poor people. The fact that somebody running for president realizes this or acknowledges this and wants to end these practices is just another great reason why Bernie Sanders' candidacy is a wonderful candidacy for the people of the United States. Going on, though, fines and fees for people who cannot afford them are counterproductive, serve no legitimate government interest, that is to say, in our terms, fines and fees for people who cannot afford them do not serve the public purpose and leave already vulnerable people, as Bernie says, even more vulnerable. As president, Bernie will ban for-profit prisons. He will make prison phone calls and other communications, such as video chats, free of charge. Audit the practices of commissaries and use regulatory authority to end price gouging and exorbitant fees. You will incentivize states and localities to end police departments' reliance on fines and fees for revenue and remove the profit motive from our reentry system and diversion community supervision or treatment programs and ensure people leaving incarceration or participating in diversion community supervision or treatment programs can do so free of charge. Now, these measures are all there to combat abuses which now exist in the system. Now, if that alone was something a candidate wanted to do, that these things would be very important and would be a big thing. But that's only one element in this huge justice and safety for all program of Bernie's. Second area is ending cash bail. He talks about hundreds of thousands of people without a criminal conviction being in jail because they can't afford bail. For instance, young people can spend hundreds of days in jail only to be acquitted. Yet the severe damage to their lives cannot be undone. This is why Bernie introduced the No Money Bail Act of 2018 to end cash bail and to end the criminalization of poverty in America. And Bernie's page says, as President, Bernie will end the use of secured bonds in federal criminal proceedings. No bail bondsmen anymore, folks. Provide grants to states to reduce their pre-trial detention populations, which are particularly high at the county level, and require states to report on outcomes as a condition of renewing their funding. Withhold funding from states that continue to use the use of cash bail systems. Ensure that alternatives to cash bail are not leading to disparities in the system. So he knows alternatives to cash bail may develop if he ends the cash bail system. So already he's planning that alternatives to cash bail not lead to disparities in the system. Third area, transform the way we police our communities. He starts out with a bow to the police community, saying that they serve our country as police officers and deserve our gratitude and respect. As a country, though, we're asking them to do far too much. As human beings, we all share common vulnerabilities, and we all share basic needs to live a stable and dignified life. He points out that we in America have not made the necessary investments to secure a strong social fabric to ensure that people's basic needs are met. So, in place of doing something about that, we ask police officers to address every societal issue that results from the tears in the fabric, whether it be mental illness, addiction, homelessness, or poverty. We ask these overstressed officers to fill roles they're not trained or equipped for, doubling as social workers, conflict arbitrators, okay, and medical responders. Last year, more police officers died of suicide than in the line of duty. That's a frightening statistic. It should be frightening for police officers, okay? But it should be frightening for all of us. It does indicate the stress placed on police officers by our system. So he says we need to shift our emphasis towards solving problems in ways that don't rely on policing and incarceration as a first option by supporting alternative strategies to make individuals and communities safer and healthier. In other ways, we must hold our police and sheriff's departments to a higher standard. And we must end harmful policing practices like racial profiling, stop and frisk, oppressive, broken windows, policing. That is, the practices that were originated in New York City by Rudy Giuliani. And the militarization of the police forces, all of which actively undermine public safety and community trust in law enforcement. Here I want to tell a personal story. When I was a child and I was walking to school, okay, in New York City, and at the time, there was a lot of graft in New York City, and there was a lot of corruption, okay, in New York City. And there were rackets, and the police were involved. And it was all very, I mean, it wasn't exactly an angelic police department. But within an urban area with a set of large apartments in it, there were policemen who walked a beat. They were in no way militarized. They had a uniform. It was blue. They had a blue cap. They were traffic cops. They walked a beat and they monitored the traffic. And they conducted us kids to school. We walked to school. They watched us when we walked to school. We had to walk 2.5 blocks to school, public school. And the Irish cop on the corner was our friend. And he was a friend of the community. And we trusted him. He was a good guy. All the time I was growing up, he never did anything that was questionable, as far as any of us knew. I don't know whether there was some graft involved or things like that. I mean, I didn't have any whiff, okay, of anything like that. But a nicer guy you could not meet. When things happened, there were robberies or things like that. The neighborhood police took care of the problem. We never saw excessive force. We never saw excessive violence. We never saw deadly shootings of unarmed people. That did not go on. We had no undermining of the integrity and public trust in the police. Bernie says violence and brutality of any kind, particularly at the hands of the police meant to protect and serve our communities, must not be tolerated. When I was a kid, okay, in New York City, this is in New York City now, okay, in a neighborhood, okay, in New York City, okay, we never had to tolerate any violence at the hands of the police. It wasn't there. We never saw it. It can be that way again. So Bernie wants to change attitudes. How? He wants to ensure law enforcement accountability and robust oversight. He's going to rescind former Attorney General Jeff Sessions' guidance on consent decrees. Jeff Sessions' guidance on consent decrees was, I think, to have as few of them as possible. Next, Bernie's going to revitalize the use of Department of Justice investigations, consent decrees, and federal lawsuits to address systemic constitutional violations by police departments. Now, I'm going to tell you, I know this is taking a while, and I don't want to go too long here, but these things are extremely important issues to discuss and to understand. when I was growing up, I did not see systemic constitutional violations by the police department of the city, okay, of New York. I didn't see it in my neighborhood. I didn't see it when I was riding to my junior high school or when I was taking the train to go to junior high school, which I did. Okay, when I got into junior high school, I went to a special school. I had to take the train there, the elevator train. Okay, that part of the subway system. Okay, that was above ground in New York City. Okay, at the time when I went to high school, I had to take a bus. Okay, it wasn't a school bus; it was a public bus. Had to pay fare. Okay, and I had to ride for, I guess it was 20, 25 minutes to get to my high school, which was a special high school. Okay. Uh, in all this time, I never saw police engaged in constitutional violations. Now, I know there were constitutional violations then, that those were present in the system when they got people into the stations in those days, okay, when they arrested people and brought them to the stations. There might be systemic constitutional violence, violations in that sort of situation. But in the public square, I never saw any of that. When people protested or used their rights of free speech in that way, or free assembly in that way, I never saw the police when I was growing up engaged in systemic constitutional violations the way they are now. We've seen it in Washington, D.C. We saw it when we saw it widespread, okay, in the Occupy movement. Of course, we saw it in the civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s, but not so much when the demonstrations were in the North. But we saw, of course, constitutional violations in the South all the time. But after a while, these ended. By 1970, when you engage in demonstrations and things like that, the police were very, very correct. Even at some points in the 1960s, the police themselves were very correct. Okay, now you might have had the FBI attending some of the demonstrations and taking pictures of people. I'm sure somewhere I've got an FBI file. But you didn't see the police abusing people or throwing large numbers of people into jails. You began to see this during the Vietnam War protests, but then they went away again. And they didn't start to surface until you got things like the protests against the World Bank during the 1990s and the Occupy movement later. But now, at the slightest excuse, the police are out there. And they're out there and they're militarized. I mean, they're military. We never saw policemen in helmets. We never saw policemen with armor on. We never saw armored vehicles in the streets of New York until very recently. I mean, this is not America, folks. It's not America. Ensure accountability, strict guidelines, and independent oversight for all federal funds used by police department. End federal programs that about provide military equipment to local police forces. This is so important. It is so important that the police locally do not present themselves as armed warriors fighting against the people. That is so important. Create a federally managed database of police use of deadly force. And along with that, I'm just adding this to the program, also create a special unit within the Justice Department to investigate any uses of deadly force, that occur, and stand ready to take over any necessary prosecutions that ought to occur. Okay, go on with Bernie's program. Provide grants for states and cities to establish civilian oversight agencies with enforceable accountability mechanisms. Establish federal standards for the use of body cameras, including establishing third-party agencies to oversee the storage and release of the police videos. That is very, very important to have that kind of watchdog in place. Mandate criminal liability for civil rights violations resulting from police misconduct. That is so important. The police have to respect the civil rights of citizens and the civil liberties of citizens under the Constitution of the United States. Otherwise, the Constitution is meaningless. They have to be protecting these rights. They can't be crushing our civil rights and our civil liberties. We can't have that anymore. Limit the use of qualified immunity to address the lack of criminal liability for civil rights violations resulting from police misconduct. Conduct a U.S. Attorney General's investigation whenever someone is killed in police custody. Absolutely. Establish a federal no-call policy, including a registry of disreputable federal law enforcement officers, so testimony from untrustworthy sources does not lead to criminal convictions. Provide financial support to pilot local and state level no-call lists. Ban the use of facial recognition software for policing. Why? Because the facial recognition software has too many false positives. It identifies the wrong people. And why? Also because the use of facial recognition software for policing is a violation of privacy. We have to come to understand that even though it seems that for the sake of order, we have to use whatever technology exists, we can't have Big Brother watching us all the time. There has to be a sphere of privacy for people. The sphere of privacy is important so that the public authorities can't grasp hold of things we do which may not be illegal, but which may embarrass us, in order to make people afraid that they will reveal things that, while not illegal, are not things we want to be revealed, in order to push us into line, in order to make us conform to a particular political line, or a particular political party, or a particular political thrust, or to a particular national dictator wannabe. We need a private sphere safe from our technology and safe from the use of that technology by our police. That is necessary for our civil liberties and our civil rights to be maintained. Bernie obviously understands that. It would be nice if other politicians did as well. Next, provide more support to police officers and create a robust non law enforcement alternative response system. That is, establish national standards for use of force by police that emphasize de escalation. Absolutely. These police here in this country seem to escalate everything. They take people aside when people happen to deliver verbal insults to the police. Okay, then the police go all, oh, we have to protect our authority. We have to protect our authority. And they pull people aside and they start to beat them. They start to beat them. Now, what does that do for their authority? What does that do for their legitimacy? It doesn't. It makes the onlooking public hate them, mistrust them, want to get back at them. It creates a climate which is dangerous for police. It's dangerous for police. And then police even more strongly feel I have to reinforce their authority with terror tactics. This is a vicious circle that escalates tensions in many, many urban and in rural communities too. Or in small town, semi urban communities where there are no longer any jobs and people have problems. Okay? And there are drug addiction problems. And there's disorder. The way to handle that is not for the police to come in and beat people senseless. That doesn't work. Require and fund police officer training on implicit bias. Then Bernie says to include biases based on race, gender, sexual orientation and identity, religion, ethnicity, and class, cultural competency, de-escalation, crisis intervention, adolescent development, and how to interact with people with mental and physical disabilities. We will ensure that training is conducted in a meaningful way with strict independent oversight and enforceable guidelines. Ban the practice of any law enforcement agency benefiting from civil asset forfeiture. Yes, ban civil asset forfeiture. Ban it. Get rid of it. Prevent it. Limit or eliminate federal criminal justice funding for any state or locality that does not apply. This is so important. How can it be constitutional that a law enforcement agency can seize one's property without due process of law? How can it be constitutional? Yet, this court thinks, our court system thinks, that in certain contexts that it is constitutional. And the lower courts think that it's constitutional almost all the time. And they collaborate with the police department, by the way, to allow it to happen. Going on. Provide funding to states, okay, and cities to create civilian corps of unarmed first responders, such as social workers, EMTs, and trained mental health professionals who can handle order maintenance violations, mental health emergencies, and low-level conflicts outside the criminal justice system, freeing police officers to concentrate on the most serious crimes. Incentivize access to counseling and mental health services for officers, diversify police officers' expand police academies, and incentivize officers to live and work in the communities they serve. That's pretty important. That is pretty important. Pretty important. Ensuring all Americans due process. Bernie says the criminal justice system is rigged. And he goes on to describe how. He talks about the profit interests of billion-dollar industries like the bail bondsman and protecting that over the interests of everyday working people. He says it's time to tell the bail industry and the private prison industry and the private probation industry and anyone who profits from incarceration that we're going to put the well-being of the people first. But that's not enough. The size of your bank account too often determines the quality of representation that a person will receive. If you cannot afford to pay fines and fees associated with criminal justice involvement, you will end up in a spiraling cycle of death with a suspended driver's license or even locked up in a debtor's prison. We need a system that works equally well for the workers and the wealthy. Absolutely right. And then he says, right to counsel. And he reviews the history that the Supreme Court had decided in Gideon versus Wainwright to guarantee all felony defendants counsel. Yet today, 90 to 95% of criminal cases are decided by a plea deal, too often without the defendant playing an active role. Yeah, the defendant has counsel, but the counsel maybe sees a defendant in a felony situation for 10 minutes before the hearing is to take place. And what happens in those 10 minutes? The counsel of the defendant, knowing very little about the case, very little about the defendant, very little about anything at all, just lets the defendant know that they have almost no chance to be found innocent by a jury and start quoting the people's statistics and then telling them, well, you can get a plea deal, and the plea deal is usually, it scares the hell out of a defendant. It's like it's like a doctor. You go into a doctor, and the doctor gives you a verdict, a diagnosis of cancer, and says, "You got to have this cut out right now. Right now. You can't let this go any further. It can be very, very dangerous." And basically tries to stampede you into the favored course of action of the doctor based on the previous experience of the doctor. Now, the doctor knows very little about you, very little about what you can do, and very little about what kinds of alternative therapies you could follow. Often the doctor knows very little about what kinds of alternative therapies there are for cancer. But what I'm saying is the authority, your doctor in this case, is trying to stampede you in a very short period of time into taking treatments that they are familiar with, and you really don't get much chance to make a rational decision. In order to make a rational decision, you have to fight for the time. You have to fight off the professionals. Well, it's even worse in the felony defendant case. You got 10 minutes with the defendant counsel. 10 minutes in which to decide whether it's best to take a plea deal, or if you think you're not guilty, whether it's best to take a chance on the criminal justice system, while undoubtedly the defendant's counsel is telling you that there's not much justice to be found in the criminal justice system. So, the effectiveness of the Gideon versus Wainwright decision, guaranteeing all felony defendants counsel, has been completely undermined. And Bernie goes on describing how all of this, whether you can rely on counsel or not, often depends on the money that you have. He points out that 77% of black Americans and 73% of Latinos in state prisons had a public defender or court appointed counsel. Yet 75% of county based public defender offices have exceeded the maximum of the recommended limit of cases received per attorney. In other words, 75% of them are overworked. They have more cases than are recommended. And of course, they're trying to process the cases as fast as they can. And Bernie says, the United States must not be a country where only the rich enjoy the protections of the Fifth Amendment. We must not have a court system that offers the best justice money can buy, quote unquote. We must guarantee all Americans their Sixth Amendment rights. As president, Bernie will triple national spending on indigent defense to $14 billion annually. I hope that's enough. But tripling it will certainly make a difference. After a review of current salaries and workload, set a minimum starting salary for all public defenders. It says create and set a national formula to assure populations have a minimum number of public defenders to assure full access to the constitutional right to due process. Establish federal guidelines for a right to counsel, including policies that reduce the number of cases overall. Create a federal agency to provide support and oversight for state public defense services. Authorize the Department of Justice to take legal action against jurisdictions that are not meeting their Sixth Amendment obligations. That is so important. Everybody's entitled to a fair trial, people. A fair trial. So important. Why do we have the disproportionate convictions in certain demographic groups? A lot of it must be due to the fact that people are not getting their right to a fair trial. Cancel all existing student debt and cancel any future student debt for public defenders through the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. That's terrific. That's terrific. Bernie says ensure accountability and fairness in prosecution. And he says, again, very correctly, very truthfully, prosecutors today have undue discretion in deciding which cases will be charged, and they're largely protected from liability when they break the rules. They also have an advantage in plea bargaining cases. People in jail without financial resources are more likely to plead guilty than fight the case, and they're more likely to receive harsher penalties than those who are not detained. The vast majority of cases, 97% of federal cases and 94% of state cases, end in plea agreements. It says we must ensure that our system is fair and that our prosecutors are accountable. And so, as president, he will rescind former Attorney General Jeff Sessions' orders on prosecutorial discretion and low-level offenses. He will appoint an Attorney General committed to public safety and creating a more just and humane criminal justice system, and he better appoint one also who is more committed to providing people with their constitutional rights and maintaining a system that provides them with their constitutional rights. He's going to limit absolute immunity for prosecutors, which is used to shield wrongdoers from liability. That's absolutely true. He's going to end the practice of jailing material witnesses. He's going to place a moratorium on the use of algorithmic risk assessment tools in the criminal justice system until an audit is completed. And he says we must ensure these tools do not have any implicit biases that lead to unjust or excessive sentences. And he wants to end mass incarceration and excessive sentencing. He points out the fact that we imprison people at a higher rate than any other nation, in no small part due to extremely harsh sentencing policies and the war on drugs. But mass incarceration has not made us any safer, he says, or reduced drug use in addition. On the contrary, it has cost lives and diverted resources that could be used to prevent crime through social investment. He says we must end the war on drugs that has disproportionately affected black and brown people. Absolutely. And guess who? Vigorously engaged in prosecutions of black and brown people when she was a prosecutor, when she was a DA, and when she was Attorney General of California. Kamala Harris. That's who. We must end the war on drugs that has disproportionately affected black and brown people. The U.S. ranks highest in incarceration rates among Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries, OECD countries, twice as much as Turkey, which has the second highest rate of incarceration. Capital punishment has failed to reduce violent crime and is disproportionately apportioned to the poor and black and brown people. It has cost innocent lives. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, for every 9 people executed in this country since the reinstatement of capital punishment, 1 innocent person on death row has been identified and exonerated. What does that tell you? It tells you that 10%, our criminal justice system, has 10% false positives in it when sentences of capital punishment are imposed. How can we have an error rate of 10% for capital punishment? That's why, as president, Bernie will abolish the death penalty, reverse the Trump administration's guidance on the use of death penalty drugs with the goal of ending the death penalty at the state level, stop excessive sentencing with the goal of cutting the incarcerated population in half, end mandatory sentencing minimums, reinstate a federal parole system, end truth in sentencing. People serving long sentences will undergo a second look process to make sure their sentence is still appropriate. End 3 strikes laws. No one should spend their life behind bars for committing minor crimes, even if they commit several of them. Yes, even if they commit 10 of them, even if they commit 20 of them. They should not have to spend their life behind bars. Invigorate and expand the compassionate release process so that people with disabilities, the sick, and the elderly are transitioned out of incarceration whenever possible. Expand the use of sentencing alternatives, including community supervision and publicly funded halfway houses. This includes funding state-based pilot programs to establish alternatives to incarceration, including models based on restorative justice and free access to treatment and social services. So important. Revitalize the executive clemency process by creating an independent clemency board removed from the Department of Justice and placed in the White House. Stop the criminalization of homelessness and spend more than $25 billion over 5 years to end homelessness. This includes doubling the McKinney-Vento homelessness assistance grants to build permanent supportive housing and $500 million to provide outreach to homeless people to help connect them to available services. In the first year of this plan, 25,000 housing trust fund units will be prioritized for housing the homeless. That sounds great. I have no idea whether 25 billion K is enough for that. Maybe the appropriate figure is 50 billion. I'd like to know how Bernie arrived at the 25 billion. Homelessness is a real serious problem. Next, end the war on drugs and stop criminalizing addiction. The disastrous policies that make up the war on drugs have not reduced drug use and violent crime. We must use effective therapeutic, not punitive solutions to address drug addiction. As president, Bernie will legalize marijuana and vacate and expunge past convictions for marijuana possession and ensure that revenue from legal marijuana is reinvested in communities hit hardest by the war on drugs. Provide people struggling with addiction with the health care they need by guaranteeing health care, including inpatient and outpatient substance abuse and mental health services with no payments or deductibles to all people as a right, not a privilege, through a Medicare for All single-payer program. Interesting how he relates the Medicare for All single-payer program to justice and safety for all. Yes, it has a strong link to justice and safety for all. Decriminalize possession of buprenorphine, which helps to treat opioid addiction, and ensure that first responders carry naloxone to prevent overdoses. Legalize safe injection sites and needle exchanges around the country, and support pilot programs for supervised injection sites, which have been shown to substantially reduce drug overdose deaths. Raise the threshold for when drug charges are federalized, as federal charges carry longer sentences. Work with states to fund and pursue innovative overdose overdose prevention initiatives. Institute a full review of the current sentencing guidelines, and end the sentencing disparity between crack and cocaine, because that has turned out to be a terrible idea and has just really placed many people in prison who don't really belong there. Then Bernie says, treat children like children. I won't read the introduction, but as president, Bernie will ban the prosecution of children under the age of 18 in adult courts. That won't happen anymore. Work to ensure that all juvenile facilities are designed for rehabilitation and growth. Ensure youth are not jailed or imprisoned for misdemeanor offenses. Ensure juveniles are not to be housed in adult prisons. End solitary confinement for youth. Also, abolish long mandatory minimum sentences and life without parole sentences for youth. And he goes on with a number of other things, okay, like eliminate criminal charges for school-based disciplinary behavior that would not otherwise be criminal, and invest in school nurses, counselors, teachers, teaching assistants, and small class sizes to address disciplinary issues. Ensure every school has the necessary school counselors and wraparound services by providing $5 billion annually to expand the sustainable community school model. end the use of juvenile fees, decriminalize truancy for all youth and their parents. Okay? Who prosecuted people for truancy in the California schools? Kamala Harris. And then she snickered about it and laughed about it. Eliminate federal incentives for schools to implement zero tolerance policies. Invest in local youth diversion programs as alternatives to the court and prison system. Work with teachers, school administrators, and the disability rights movement to end restraint and seclusion discipline in schools. And then Bernie also talks about reforming our decrepit prison system to make jails and prisons more humane. And in the service of this, he wants to enact a prisoner bill of rights that guarantees ending solitary confinement, having access to free medical care in prisons and jails, including professional and evidence-based substance abuse and trauma-informed uh, uh, mental health treatment. Incarcerated trans people have access to all the health care they need. That is going to be guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Access to free educational and vocational training. This includes ending the ban on Pell Grants for all incarcerated people without any exceptions. Living wages and safe working conditions, including maximum work hours for all incarcerated people for their labor. Yes, living wages for those in prison would be great because they would be able to bank those living wages. And when they came out of prison, they would be able to have a stake which would allow them to get started, to go back to civilian life, and maybe have a decent civilian life. When you couple that with the job guarantee program for work, we could get people out of the prison to work vicious circle system. We would undercut completely recidivism. The rates of recidivism would fall very, very low. And the right to vote. All voting age Americans must have the right and meaningful access to vote, whether they're incarcerated or not. We will re-enfranchise the right to vote to the millions of Americans who have had their vote taken away by a felony conviction. We'll end prison gerrymandering, ensuring incarcerated people are counted in their communities, not where they are incarcerated. He talks about establishment of an Office of Prisoner Civil Rights and Civil Liberties within the Department of Justice to investigate civil rights complaints from incarcerated individuals and provide independent oversight to make sure that prisoners are housed in safe and healthy environments. Protection from sexual abuse and harassment, including mandatory federal prosecution of prison staff who engage in such misconduct, access to their families, including unlimited visits, phone calls, and video calls. Okay, a determination for the most appropriate setting for people with disabilities and safe, accessible conditions for people with disabilities in prisons and jails. And Bernie goes on to talk about a just transition post-release period. And he has a whole host of things that he's talking about there. And I've already been on for too long, so I won't have a chance to go over them. But I urge you to go to the link that I provided to read the rest of this program. He wants to end cycles of violence and provide support to survivors, of crime. And he has a series of bullet points for that and major subtopics for that, like stop the cycle of violence, But do that by prioritizing the most serious offenses, provide adequate support to crime survivors, and bullet points under each of these categories. Okay, new category, he wants to reverse the criminalization of disability. And he points to the fact that 1 in 5 inmates in prisons are people with cognitive disability, while another 1 in 5 inmates have a serious mental illness. So just reversing the criminalization of these people is going to cut down substantially on the population in jail. He also points out that approximately half of all people who die in police-involved shootings have a disability. So he has a series of bullet points about what he will do to reverse the criminalization of people who are disabled. He'll also invest in community living to guarantee mental health to people who are disabled as a human right. And there are a series of bullet points on that. Then, a new topic. He wants to invest in our communities. He says we spend $38 million a day detaining people awaiting trial. And then he has a series of measures for that, and they overlap. They include the Jobs Guarantee Program, which many of you already know about. They include passing a $15 an hour as the minimum wage. And a number of other bullet points, including transportation benefits to and from health services who need it. That's a part of the Medicare for All plan. He wants to enact paid family leave. He wants to ensure that people who interacted with the justice system are still able to get the rehabilitation services they need and are able to find housing and employment. And he goes on, and on, with many other bullet points for the purpose of investing in our communities. This last of his categories goes even way beyond the criminal justice system. So, this is a very comprehensive plan. It will impact everybody in America. It will make America a much more safe and happy and kind place. And this plan alone, I think this plan alone, coupled with the obvious sincerity of Bernie and his commitment to things like this throughout his whole career, provide additional reasons why he is just a phenomenal candidate for president. So again, I wasn't able to go through the whole thing, but I got through a lot of it, and you can read the rest of it for yourself. I think it is a fantastic plan, just a fantastic plan. So I'm going to look in now on your comments, see what comments and questions you may have. And we have Randy Hedgebeth is here, and Lynn Dufour says Bernie has the only progressive platform All others are just copying from Bernie. Well, I think Elizabeth Warren has a few good ideas too. Uh, okay, but I agree. The mainstream press is talking about how comprehensive her plans are, and she has a plan for everything. Well, I think Bernie had a plan for almost everything long before Elizabeth did, and that it's really pretty essential that if you're impressed with her plans and are looking at them, spend a good deal of time, okay, in looking for them. You should also go to Bernie's website and look at his stances and his plans for every issue, and then compare them to Warren's. And while you're comparing them, also keep in mind, also keep asking yourself the question: who, under great pressure from establishment forces, is more likely to back down from their plan? Is it Bernie Sanders? Okay, or is it Elizabeth Warren? Or is it Kamala Harris? Or is it Joe Biden? Who's the person who's most likely to fight to the last man for their plans? Who is likely to bring the fight for justice across the board to the fore? I'm really asking, who is the modern day Moses? Who cares about justice? Lynn says, cannabis should not be making people rich while folks are incarcerated for it. Absolutely. And Dale says, the whole damn thing is a racket of epic but proportions. And you're quite right. That's what it is. Hi, Steve. Hi, Kathy Langan. Hi, Dolores Pierce. How are you, folks? Dale Weaver says there were APCs on the streets of Newark, New Jersey during the 1968 riots. It was surreal. Yeah, the armored personnel carriers. Yes, I know. There were in some of the cities, but it was rare in cities. That's probably the first time that happened, I think. We didn't see that before. And Devorah joined, and Carl Barringer said, your daughter sent me your link. And Carl says, hey, Mike, I figured you would like this. I don't see Mike here, whoever Mike is, but thank you, Carl. And thank you for joining. And Carl says, so felons will be able to vote. And Carl says, I will. And he says, check out the link. Laugh out loud. Not a felon. And he says, wait a minute, is this a Bernie Sanders support page? No, this is not a support page. I'm doing this on my personal page, but I am in no way, well, the only way I'm connected to the Bernie Sanders campaign is that I'm one of the million volunteers he has, but I haven't been called upon by his campaign to do anything for it, okay, as yet. And that's in a completely private capacity. In my live streaming capacity, I am not working for Bernie's campaign. Do I personally support Bernie, however? Well, obviously I do. I mean, I think a great deal, okay, of Bernie. There are many reasons for that. One thing is, we come from a similar background. We both come from New York City. He comes from Brooklyn. Okay, I come from the Bronx. I think my family was a little more prosperous than his. So we had five people in my family, and we lived in a five-room apartment. He had four people in his family, and he lived in a 3.5 room apartment. Uh, he lived in a rent control apartment, I believe. I lived in a rent control apartment too. Okay. Uh, my father was a small businessman. Uh, the news had a big place in our house. Newspapers, okay, were very important. The Times was very important. The New York Post was very important. At that time, okay, the New York Post was a fairly lefty newspaper. A fairly lefty newspaper. It was, for those times, I would say, on the progressive scale, it stood probably, well, it was pretty close to the nation at that point. It was that kind, okay, of lefty. As I was growing up, I read both of those papers. When I got into college, a few years before Bernie, Cornell, uh, I engaged in protests. At first, they were rather trivial protests. They were basically about ending curfews in the dorms and creating a closer tie between the administration and the student body and things like that. But rapidly, they escalated into protests about more serious things. I was a member of Students for Democratic Society before Bernie Sanders was. I don't think that he was in graduate school yet at that time. Or uh, I was a member of Students for Democratic Society when it first was renamed. It was originally the Student League for Industrial Democracy and was founded in the 1930s as the student wing of the UAW, actually. But some of the labor union radicalism was all finished by 1959, so they changed their name to have a broader connotation, the Students for a Democratic Society. If you've studied the 1960s, you know that involved the radicalization begun by the chapter in the University, okay, of Michigan, and then escalated further, okay, at Berkeley, and was instrumental in the free speech movement, and that grew into the anti-Vietnam War protests. Okay, I was involved in some of the early protests uh, concerning the Vietnam War and in some of the early protests in the civil rights movement. I was there for the Vietnam teach-ins in 1963, if I recall correctly. Uh, and I was at a civil rights march led by Dr. King in Detroit that was attended by more than 100,000 people. So we have backgrounds that are very similar. I didn't go into politics. Instead, okay, I went to graduate school. Okay, I got a PhD. I taught for some time. Then I went to policy research. and my career then led me into other things. And I didn't really become active again politically until 2008 and 2009. All this time, Bernie was working in politics. He was in the wilderness in politics, but he stayed in it and he was working in it. And he never forgot. Okay? He never forgot the background that he had and the history he learned about the New Deal, okay, and FDR, and what radicalism was all about in the 1930s, okay, and the 1940s, and the 1960s. He learned all that, and so did I. And so today we have very, very similar points of view. And 2016 was the first time that I ever saw a presidential candidate that actually represented my views pretty much across the board. And that hasn't changed today. And so that's why I like Bernie. That's sort of the history of it. Anyway, any other comments or questions? Susan says if you click the events button on Bernie's website and enter your zip code, you can find Bernie volunteer events in your area. Yes, I know, Susan. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? While I wait, I'm going to finish my wine. Okay, so since I don't see any more questions or comments, I'm going to ask you to share, like, and subscribe to this video. It will be up rather shortly, probably tonight or tomorrow morning. Okay, but okay, it'll be up on my YouTube page. So I have a YouTube page. Okay, Joe Firestone or Joseph M. Firestone. I forget okay exactly what it is. But for now, I also would like to call your attention to my share, like, and subscribe page and ask you to please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Uh, since I don't have any monetization through Facebook or through some other means, any contributions that you can make on my Patreon page are greatly appreciated and help me to keep the lights on here. So thank you very much. I'll check in one more time. There we go. I'll say one final time, this is not a Bernie Sanders support page. It has nothing directly to do with the Bernie Sanders campaign. I do all of this commentary myself. There are many live streams here that don't have too much to do with the Bernie Sanders campaign. I have primarily an issues orientation rather than a candidate orientation. Kathy says thanks, and thank you, Kathy. I appreciate your coming. Thank you very much for being here. And good night, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow night when I'll be back with some more live streams. Tomorrow night I'll probably have two live streams. I had only one tonight, and the reason for that was that I wanted to cover most of Bernie's plan for you and to give you a commentary on it and to show you how comprehensive and worthwhile this plan is. So again, good night. I am going to sign off now.